they find out by Lilac Sky 128, Chapter 7, Arthur, Part 1. It was a peaceful day. Really peaceful. Really abnormally peaceful. There were no magic threats, no armies invading, not even the slightest skirmish on the northern borders. In short, everything was looking very suspicious indeed. Arthur was looking over some paperwork, and really, who knew the king had designed so many things? And the lords were arguing. The lords always argued. It was rather irritating. Still, apart from that, it was quiet. Arthur sighed. It was true that his father was having a bad day today, but he was sure that Gaius was more than equipped to deal with it, and no one could know anything of it, so he would act normal, ignoring the sense of unease in his gut that told him things were about to go very wrong indeed. He didn't know whether it was born out of worry for his father or the unnatural peace that had fallen over Camelot. After all he could do now was sit back and wait. Merlin had been going to tell Arthur. Really, he had, and he still fully intended to, and definitely would, when Gawain stopped sitting on him. Gawain! No moving. No, not up. No way. This is a terrible idea. Gawain, said Gwen, and Gawain pretended that he wasn't frightened by this tone of voice in the slightest. Get off Merlin! Now! Gawain crossed his arms and sighed. Fine, he said, getting up. You are free to make your own mistakes, but... He held up a finger. Wait 1 minute. Gawain rushed off up the stairs, and Merlin shrugged at Gwen and Gaius, who both looked equally bemused. Gawain returned, with Lancelot, Ilian, Percival, and Leon. Merlin tilted his head. Seriously, Gawain? Gawain ignored this, clapping his hands together and stepping towards the throne room. Right? Are we all ready, then? Lancelot looked slightly apologetically at Merlin before moving off past him. Merlin rolled his eyes. What had started as a quite serious and nerve-wracking confession to Arthur had turned into full-blown farce, which was probably what Gawain wanted, and Merlin couldn't quite decide whether this was better or worse. Still, he couldn't deny it was better to have support. So, if Arthur tried to kill him, Merlin winced a little at the thought. It's going to be fine, he thought to himself. Just fine. It's going to be fine. He kept this refrain up until they reached the doors of the throne room. Gawain flung the doors open as Gaius put a reassuring hand on Merlin's shoulder, and Gwen smiled up at him. Everyone's mouths dropped open as the doors opened to reveal the scene before them. It turned out that Arthur had been completely right. Things were just too peaceful to be true. Although he still hadn't been expecting his half-sister to appear in the throne room in a swirl of smoke, and seriously, how cliche did she need to be? She had quickly disarmed the lords who had leapt to his aid and managed to send his sword flying halfway across the room so that she now held him at... Well, it would have been sword point, only she wasn't actually using one, so it was more like finger point. Or maybe magic point, or... Hello, brother, she said with a sneer. Right, he remembered. Focus. Morgana, he breathed. This was the first time he had been confronted with her since she had betrayed Camelot. He had thought he had managed his feelings on the subject, had thought he had put all his brotherly affection aside and made her the enemy. He had been wrong. Because when he looked at her now, yes, she was obviously threatening him, and he could only detect anger and hatred in her features, but her eyes were the same. They were the eyes of his playmate as a child, the eyes of the girl who had once, although he didn't care to admit it, bested him in a sword fight. They were the eyes of the woman who had offered him advice and counseled him to do the right thing. They were the eyes of his sister, and they had not changed. Why? He asked before he could stop himself. He couldn't tell if she was going to answer, couldn't know what she was going to say. And he never got a chance to find out, because at that moment the double doors burst open and Merlin, Gwen, Gaius, and the knights walked in, Gawain leading the way. They all stopped still at the sight that greeted them. Arthur vaguely thought that it was convenient they were here, and a little odd, now that he came to think of it. Morgana, said Merlin, stepping forward. Arthur inwardly groaned. What was he doing? He knew what Merlin was like in fights, and he couldn't for the life of him think of a reason why Merlin would pick this moment to suddenly play the hero. Merlin, said Morgana with a sneer. Arthur frowned. He knew Morgana hated them all, but she didn't even put that amount of hate into her voice when she was talking to him. And there was something else. Anger, bitterness. That was all there. was something more like a history he didn't know about. "What are you doing?" asked Merlin as he walked towards her, unflinching even under an impressive glare. "Oh, just tying up loose ends," she said. Arthur noticed that the knights were also advancing and had all drawn their swords. Morgana had evidently noticed, too, as her eyes glowed, and they appeared to be pushed back slightly. Merlin seemed to smile slightly at that. "Seriously?" He was smiling. "Call off the dogs, Merlin," Morgana sneered. Gawain glared at her, but for once in his life, kept silent. When Merlin made no response, she held up a finger and said, "Oh no, wait. That's you, isn't it?" Merlin glared at her. "Arthur's ever-faithful lapdog. Only—" She tilted her head to one side. "There's one thing you haven't told you, master, isn't there?" Merlin's eyes widened as she laughed. "Oh, don't let me get in the way of your heartfelt confession, please. Go ahead." "Wait, how do you—" Merlin stopped, and the realization dawned on him. "You were in Uther's room." Morgana smiled. "Well worked out, Merlin." "You gave him the knife." Arthur's eyes widened as Morgana laughed. His father had had a knife, but what had happened? And why had Merlin even been there? No one should have been, save for Gaius. "Yes," said Morgana, and all the traces of his childhood playmate were wiped from her features. "I did. She waved a hand. I had hoped he would kill Gaius, maybe himself." Arthur could see Merlin gritting his teeth at the mention of Gaius. But when Gwen came in, Arthur's panicked eyes flicked to Gwen, who was, thankfully, seemingly unharmed, although she was staring at her former friend with undisguised shock and anger. She sought his eyes and gave him a reassuring smile, although her face was still clouded with worry. "But then you just had to step in." Arthur's gaze returned to Morgana, who was addressing Merlin with pure venom in her voice. "Merlin," she drawled mockingly, "the unsung hero of every hour." Arthur frowned. Morgana's taunts had now taken a different route. What did she mean? "I wasn't going to let you or anyone else hurt the people I care about." Arthur was taken aback by the steel in Merlin's voice. He sounded determined. He sounded like he meant it. If Arthur hadn't known any better, he might have believed him. What surprised him was Morgana's reaction. She flinched slightly, looking more vulnerable than she had done since she appeared before them, and looked at Merlin with an almost indescribable expression. Again, if Arthur didn't know any better, he would have said it was sadness. Morgana recovered herself swiftly. "You may not have a choice." Merlin laughed. He actually laughed. "Morgana," he said, his voice dropping low, "have you forgotten our last encounter?" Arthur's eyes flicked from Merlin to Morgana as an energy seemed to pulse between them. "What last encounter?" "Would you like to tell Arthur about it?" Morgana said, jutting her chin out defiantly. It was such a Morgana gesture that it made Arthur's heart ache. He tried to focus on her words. What did she have over Merlin? Merlin took a deep breath. "I will if I have to." Morgana stared at him. "Go on, then," she said, daring him. "Arthur, Merlin sighed. "Look, this isn't exactly how I imagined telling you." Merlin's eyes met Arthur's. "Spit it out, Merlin," Arthur said, frustration winning out. "Honestly, Camelot was under threat, and Merlin was, well, dithering. Merlin took another deep breath. Arthur waited impatiently. At that moment, Merlin flung his arm out, his eyes glowed a bright gold, and Morgana was thrown back. "Magic," he finished. Arthur could only stare at him. "Nice try, Morgana," Merlin said, turning to her. Morgana glared at him. Arthur vaguely registered that she had been making a move to attack him when Merlin had used magic. Merlin. It made no sense. He couldn't process it, his brain working desperately to catch up with what he had just witnessed. Merlin and magic, how was that even possible? Idiotic, clumsy Merlin, ever loyal, ever joking, with wisdom he'd never truly realized, with something about him that Arthur had never been able to figure out. And then, unbidden, a memory came to him of the first time he met Merlin. "I could take you apart with one blow. I could take you apart with less than that." And he had laughed at a threat that he knew now had been all too real. Merlin had been lying to him this whole time. Arthur's eyes refocused on Merlin now, who had turned away from him and was saying in a voice that was wholly unfamiliar to Arthur, "Really, Morgana, you have forgotten who you're dealing with." How could Merlin actually sound threatening? "Tell me," said Merlin, his tone casual, almost disinterested. "After everything you've heard about Emerus, did it ever sound like a good idea to attack his home?" Morgana struggled, clearly bound by some magic. Merlin's magic. The entire room was stunned, their gazes all fixed on the exchange between the two. "You do not truly believe that this will be your home, do you?" Morgana hissed. "Not now!" Merlin's eyes flicked from her to Arthur and then back, seemingly shaking himself of those thoughts. "Maybe not," he said, "but for as long as I live, I will be loyal to Camelot, to Arthur, and you will never harm the people I care about, Morgana, and nor will anyone else." Arthur stared at Merlin. Merlin spoke with such fierceness, such passion, as he proclaimed his loyalty to Arthur and to Camelot. It was hard not to believe him. "Are you alone?" Merlin continued. Morgana sneered at him. "I'm hardly likely to tell you, now am I?" Merlin scrutinized her for a second. "So, not many of you then." He tilted his head as Morgana continued to glare at him. "Mordred?" Morgana made no response, but Merlin nodded as though she had. "Right. Where?" Morgana still said nothing. "Really, Morgana, you may as well give it up. Leave now." Merlin paused. "And I won't kill you." "Not much of a deal," was Morgana's biting reply. "Only deal you're getting," Merlin countered. And then his eyes glowed gold again, and Merlin thought that he'd never get used to that. Morgana seemed to struggle harder against invisible bonds. Then she smirked. "Fine," she said. "I'll leave you with..." She looked at Arthur. "Your precious prince." She shook her head at him. "If you think he'll be any better to you, I warned you once before, Merlin. He will see you burn." And it was with those words that Morgana departed in much the manner she had come. Merlin waited for a few moments and then nodded. "They're gone," he said, almost to himself. And then he started to turn back to Arthur when there was a cry from the crowd, whilst Arthur was still frozen in disbelief. "Magic! The boy has magic! Against them! Gods!" Arthur was still frozen as he saw the guards approach, and Merlin sighed, his expression resigned as he turned, and found a line of knights blocking the way of the guards. Gawain smiled at the guards as the knights formed a protective barrier between them and Merlin, and he uttered just 3 words. "Just try it."